All right, and we're live. Well, now we're live. And we're live. So, all right, so it's time to talk about the Beijing Winter Olympics, the 2022 Olympics. It's pretty crazy because 2021 was when we had the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, but now I guess we have to do the 2022 Olympics just the year after, but that's what's happening. But this time there's a real big political event going on because the US has decided to stage a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which is pretty cool news, I guess. And we're going to talk about it now. So it's interesting. There's a lot of history to this. Everyone should be feeling some little twinges of the Cold War with this. And then, yeah, really quick, I'm going to just talk about where this stuff comes from, stuff about boycotts, why it happened, what other countries are gonna do, and what it comes from, and then kind of where all this is gonna lead. Because this is an interesting event, right? The first thing we should all feel is like major Cold War deja vu, because this is a common way that the United States and the Soviet Union took shots at each other during the Cold War. It was like, hey, I'm not going to the Moscow Olympics, and everyone else who's on my side isn't going to go either, and I'm not going to the LA Olympics, and blah, 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 blah. And now we're starting to get something very similar. And that's actually big news. And matters a lot for China, and it matters a lot for the United States, and kind of for all these countries that are stuck in between. Because, yeah, this is a minor event. Like, the Olympics aren't a sort of major geopolitical event, which is kind of funny because they actually were back in the day. Like, back in ancient Greece, the Olympics were like the place to be. Every 4 years, all the Greek city-states, all the major politicians and merchants and politicians and noblemen, great warriors, tradesmen, everyone came to the Olympics, and they, along with stuff at Delphi, that was like a huge event. And that was where politics happened. That's where everything happened. That was sort of the marquee, date on sort of the diplomatic and social calendar in the ancient times. But that's not really where we are today. But nonetheless, this is a major event because it's also just a big difference. 2008 was when China was really starting to open up to the world, and it used the Beijing Olympics, not the Winter Olympics, in 2008 to showcase its emergence as a modern country, and the whole world played along, right? No one said, hey, you're, terrorizing these people, and you're kicking out these people, and you're, genociding these people. There was none of that. It was just like, all good. Let us show our absolute best side to the world. Let's, completely change up. Let's change up the hygiene procedures and all this stuff in Beijing. Like, they did all sorts of stuff to put on the absolute best face for the world. And then they had these, really marvelous sort of opening ceremony. Everyone was very impressed, and you had all these enormous facilities, and everyone was even more impressed. And it was a really big event. For the Communist Party and for the leadership, there's few other events in the last 20 years, 50 years, that have done as much to raise its profile, both internally and to the rest of the world. So China, the Chinese people saw, wow, look what the Communist Party has done. The entire world has come to China. The entire world is impressed by everything China's doing. We're also winning a bunch of medals and all that kind of stuff. And it was a big moment. It's really good for the party's credibility. It's really good for, it was basically really good for everything, like on every level. Except for the facilities aren't used. If you actually go to the Olympics, like, this is kind of normal for every Olympics, but you go to the Olympic facilities in Beijing and they're just like a random collection of unused buildings, like impressive, cool-looking architectural monuments that are just unused in this random part of off a train station. But that's just kind of the way it goes. But the thing to know is that the use of something like the Olympics for politics to sort of have a geopolitical backhand this way and a little uppercut this way. This is pretty old, right? Even back in the first millennium BC in ancient Greek times, Athens would boycott the Olympics and sometime in the 4th century, and it was a really common thing to do. You're like protesting your enemy, your rival, whatever, and this has always been used like this. And then obviously more recently, China boycotted the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, And like I was alluding to earlier, the United States refused to go to the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and then the Soviet Union, boycotted in retaliation, the 1984 LA Olympics, and it went on and on. And this stuff it would drag in all the sort of Warsaw Pact countries, along with sort of some NATO countries and all this, and then you'd sort of see how things broke down for other nations as it happened. It was a really great way to see what was going on. But that's kind of different. There's also a difference between a full boycott and a diplomatic boycott. So a full boycott means like we're not going, none of the athletes are going, no officials are going, no coaches are going, no trainers are going, nobody's going, nothing. And that happened with the U.S. and the Soviet Union a couple times. What's actually happening with China is much more minor. It's just a diplomatic boycott. That just means like U.S. government officials aren't going to the Beijing Games, right? So you're not going to have all the prime ministers and all sorts of ambassadors in the stadium, in the seats during the opening ceremony, and making Beijing feel like the whole world is like, and foreign representatives and dignitaries are all watching it. That's not going to happen. But the athletes are still going. So it's not like the U.S. isn't still going to win and compete and get medals and all that kind of stuff. It's a more minor thing. It's much more of a diplomatic sort of backhand and saying, no, we don't want this. And just so you know, I mentioned earlier that the reason the U.S. is officially doing this is because of Xinjiang, which is basically everything: genocide, forced labor, internment camps, surveillance, all the stuff they're doing in Xinjiang. All of that is now percolated up enough to the U.S. government that it's decided, we're going to take a stand. But of course, this is a bit of a fraud on the government's part. They're using that more for their own purposes, right? I mean, there's problems in Xinjiang have been going on for at least 10 years. At least, 12 and forever if you want to be honest about it. But the government's just doing it now, and it's just part of politics. It's part of what happened when Trump, at the end of his administration, sort of declared Xinjiang a genocide, and the Biden administration went along with that. And now, this is one of those legal things where there's it's a certain genocide means something, and certain laws and certain regulations, and so you have to make certain responses, and sort of the Biden administration has been kind of forced to move along with all of these things just because it accepted that designation. And then there's also just moral impulse and, values that are implicated in all this. You're like, okay, you call it a genocide and you're doing absolutely nothing for it, right? But of course, I've talked about in other episodes, and I'll keep talking about it, that you're not treating China like it's a genocidal country. You're not allowing imports and certain things from Xinjiang, but the entire country still functions. It's still essential to all the supply chains that really matter. And, right, this is just a piece of the picture. And this is, again, it's being used politically. So the Chinese government's super pissed about all this. And the reason is because it's like, okay, you're specifically taking this as a way to come take a shot at China. And which is true. I mean, that's what the U.S. is doing. So that's what we're talking about. Again, the big difference here is like athletes are still going, though. So this is not totally threatening to China. It's not like the U.S. is like not sending American athletes, and then all the Western major countries aren't sending athletes, so it would become a sort of farce Olympics. Like if you got rid of the athletes and suddenly the Olympics were no longer sort of credible as a real test of skill and talent and all that because the pool of competition was so weak, that would kind of undermine everything. But that's not what we're getting. We're just getting this diplomatic thing. And part of the reason the U.S. isn't doing that is because there's a lot of money to be made in this, and Americans love athletics, and they want to see people compete. They'd be super pissed if there was just no Olympics and China was just racking up all the medals and you didn't get to see this stuff. It's not good. And then obviously for pure monetary interest, a lot of advertising, a lot of brands, a lot of teams, there's a lot of money in this. And it's a really common thing for the U.S. with China has been we don't really want to disturb a lot of commercial relations because there's so much invested in this. And this is just another area where you don't want to go the full way. So far, the U.S. could decide, hey, we're going to do a full boycott, although that's pretty unlikely. Realistically, it's just tough, especially when athletes have been training for years and years, and this is what they want to do. And there's a similar thing to the Peng Shuai situation I talked about last week, where the whole world, the world tennis bodies are saying, hey, do we punish all athletes and all audience, basically all of our athletes, all of our players and a major audience because of the actions of a small group of people? It's a similar kind of thing with China. You punish all the American athletes who've been training for years and years to try and compete in this because of you're suddenly deciding that the Xinjiang thing is worthy of this form of retaliation, could also honestly be seen as a bit of a punishment against just random athletes who have nothing to do with any of this. So that's part of it. And yeah, so we have this U.S. diplomatic boycott where this is where the really interesting stuff happens, is because it's not just the U.S. When the U.S. does something, everybody else has to kind of pick a side. So, Australia and Canada and a bunch of random countries, honestly, like Kosovo or Lithuania, like they're also joining the United States on this boycott. Others, I think, like the United Kingdom, they're not getting on board. France probably obviously isn't getting on board. Then you get other sort of quasi diplomatic boycott. So the Japanese prime minister isn't going to be going to the Olympic ceremony. They're kind of doing various snubs, right? This is all sort of political, socio-political machinations and sort of little digs at each other. This is what's going on. You're sort of like, no, we're not going to give you this. And no, we'll kind of go, but we're not going to fully acknowledge this. And obviously these sort of slights really get at the human social primate creatures that we are. And China's definitely feeling it. And what the U.S. does is it doesn't only give, the U.S. decision doesn't only give the U.S., it doesn't sort of force people to come on to one side or the other. It also gives them license to do what they wouldn't do by themselves otherwise. So, for example, Australia is not on its own, out of nowhere, going to just boycott the Beijing Olympics, most likely. I mean, sometimes it could if things got really bad, or Canada's not going to just out of the blue do that and then just individually antagonize China. That's not smart. And honestly, I mean, the Chinese despise this sort of thing, and they immediately retaliate back against all these countries. They do. They would. That's just kind of the way things operate there. So why would you do that, right? You already have all these problems with China. You need China in various ways. You're not going to just suddenly just antagonize them for this kind of small reason, because there's no deep economic benefit or cultural or political thing like that happens. I mean, this is really, the Olympics in particular are just a forum where the United States typically competes against one or two other countries for all the medals, and that's kind of where it happens. You don't have people that are like, oh my God, like the Canadians are doing so amazing, and now, this has changed the world, and this is the best Olympics ever. You don't really get that. Instead, you just get, we're winning some and we're losing some, but it's really the U.S. versus originally the Soviet Union, now the U.S. versus China for the medals, right? It's just like another common place where you see the same kind of geopolitical competition happening again and again, like in every area. So that doesn't happen. But the big difference, 2008 was really like China's coming out party. That was, the whole world saw that insane opening ceremony. There was like all these people twirling and all this kind of crazy stuff going on. And that was, it was a huge moment, especially for the Communist Party. People forget, late 1990s China, that was a mess. It was an absolute mess. Early 2000s, they had SARS. They almost had a giant, similar COVID type outbreak happen all over the world. And they had massive problems in their industrial plant, in their financial system. All this stuff was just crushing the population. They even had they had political problems going on in the background. They had, old prime ministers and premiers and stuff that were really still involved in a lot of things. It was really tough to get the sort of definite transition to a new leadership. These things were all happening. It was a mess. So that was a huge moment. Now we're getting now we're in 2022. The Beijing, if the 2008 Olympics were a bit of a sort of coming out party, then to 2022 kind of feels like a good riddance party. Like, you just gave the whole world COVID, which is another reason countries can, get on board with this. So Australia has been pretty big at pushing that there needs to be more research into what happened with COVID, et cetera, which, again, if people are interested, you can go see. I have a sort of episode on that, a real podcast episode about that. Check it out. It's on this channel too. If that's what we get, and we get this massive 3-year endless, COVID problem, what do we want to do things with Beijing anymore? 2022 is becoming the good riddance party. It's becoming like the get out of here. We don't want anything to do with you and kind of what you stand for and what you value. And it's spreading into all these different areas. It's Taiwan, it's Hong Kong, it's the stuff going on with India and the Himalayas. It's all this stuff. It's just sort of everywhere. And then obviously the worst is Xinjiang with what's going on with the Uyghurs there. And now we're really seeing it. And so the way to think about the Olympics and kind of what's going to happen as this goes forward is, this is going to show the fault lines, some of the fault lines in the political world, right? So the U.S. makes this declaration, and then it's sort of like the first earthquake, and then you sort of see where all the cracks appear. That's kind of the way to look at this. So you're going to see which countries are sort of feel bound to stick with China, or that are unwilling to go along with the U.S. A great example, of course, being France, who has no interest in going along with the U.S., especially after the U.S. kind of, stole a big military contract to Australia, like from up beneath it's just pulled the rug out from under it. That's a bad thing. And obviously other countries that are really nearby China don't have quite the leeway to do these sorts of things. So South Korea, for example, isn't going to do enormously antagonistic things to China when it's right next door. So it's always important to keep in mind. Like some countries are going to use this to show their irritation in various ways. And most of this stuff in the end doesn't really matter. Again, it lets you read the tea leaves, lets you read the political landscape. And sometimes it's really just a minor thing. Like there might be one politician in a country that's trying to get one specific deal with China, so they're going to stay, right? Some new prime minister of like Malaysia or whatever, some African country, like that could be going on. Or you could have, right? You could have the exact opposite, right? You could have a whole cohort of, oligarchs or something in a country. They need this business, so they're like absolutely not allowing anyone to sort of go against China in various ways. So some of the stuff is behind the scenes. You can't really read it, but the big countries, the name brand countries, you can kind of see really quickly where things stand. And that's pretty important because, as I was saying earlier, kind of end on this really quick, China is going to flip out about this stuff. It is a culture where face is very important. It's a culture where this is essential to all sort of business and commercial and political dealings and operations. It's all about how you present to the world and whether you're creating the sort of impression that gives you the dignity and the gravitas to do what you kind of need to do to get the sort of results you want. And that has been really one of the most challenging things for the Communist Party to get. It wants to have both massive authority and power and face within its country with the people and with the rest of the world. And over the last, really since the Xi administration came into power, like this has been where things are, where the rubber's hitting the road, because you can't market to just the people in China and say, hey, we're the super nationalist, most powerful country in the world. Everyone's going to be doing what we say. And then you can't actually get everyone to do what you say. Like it just isn't working for China in general. So this is one of those areas where it's just starting to lash out at all sorts of countries, right? So it's trying to appease the domestic audience. Like how dare Australia do this? How dare Canada, go along with the U.S. and grab one of our major, CEOs or CFOs of a major company? Like how they like hold her against her will or whatever. And you just do that. It goes on and on. And the diplomatic corps in China is very invested in this because they don't know what else to do. So you're in this place where these sort of minor things, something like an Olympics, which is really just like a random sports event, is going to become like a massive event in China because it implies a lot more. It's like in the same way that some minor little event in Hong Kong can seem, like just allow an election, have something. What does it matter, China? It's like, no, this could be the little spark that leads to all sorts of problems, that leads to a loss of legitimacy and authority and credibility. And that's really what the government is trying to prevent, the Chinese government. And it's crazy to us to see kind of how much it will sort of overreact to things and just freak out and kind of lose its connection to reality in a lot of ways. But it is deeply connected to the reality in China about what it needs to do to stay in power and to not have total chaos spread all across the country. So we should keep that in mind. And we should also expect probably that they're going to boycott the 2028 LA Olympics. Maybe not France. I mean, that's another thing. France isn't going to do this. They don't want China abandoning, the Olympics and putting them, giving that a black eye as well. So, but, the U.S. could definitely expect the LA Olympics, which I'm going to try and go to, we could easily not see China there. So that is where we are. And in this case, we should all be feeling very, very, very strong Cold War vibes with this, because that was a huge thing back then. Just all these, using the Olympics as a forum to sort of air all your grievances and your opinions about other countries and what you think they should be doing. This is kind of back where we are today. And it's a pretty cool thing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, sort of get a sense of what's going on with the Olympic boycotts and where they're headed, where they kind of came from, how old the roots are, and how this really goes back all the way to the first millennium. Like people are actually doing the same thing of boycotting different countries, different city-states, whatever back then. It's a really interesting thing. So we'll follow it. And if any sort of updates happen, I'm definitely going to say something on here. And anyone who liked this, definitely subscribe to the channel, check it out. I talk about China, I talk about where things are going, what it means that the world of globalization is sort of coming to an end, and how to think about it, how to sort of make sense of this and be able to consume the information about what's going on in a sort of intelligent way. So you're not just always grabbed by the latest crazed opinion or headline. You can actually sort of make your way through this information. I think it's really useful, and I'll keep doing it. So